having a conversation with Professor Jerome Carson from the Psychology Department at the University of Bolton. How are you today?
Great. Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Yeah, just getting used to the changes that are about to come upon us as lockdown eases.
I know, changes again. I think we've only just got used to the first set of changes, and now it's all easing and we're all perhaps coming back on campus.
Yeah, I think that would be a slow process, but it will. I think it will start after Easter.
You think?
Much more so.
Whilst we started with the topic of COVID, how about we stick with it? So how has COVID been for you?
Well, I think the first lockdown was very hard because I'm clinically vulnerable. So it meant that I wasn't allowed to go out of the house, and I stuck to that religiously. So I didn't go out for, crikey, it was about 9 weeks.
Wow.
I mean, it really was a difficult time. But early on, my sister had sent me a message which was, don't count the days, make the days count. And I thought, well, hold on. Now, she'd been diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer.
Oh, wow.
So she's suddenly looking at the world in a different way. And I mean, of course, as we all know, how you look at the world determines how you feel. So I started actually, instead of feeling sorry for myself, actually thinking, right, okay, let's get on and do something.
So what did you do?
Well, I think one of the things I did was I formed little research bubbles. So, I mean, I supervise student projects at undergraduate level, master's level, and at PhD. So, you know, a number of the students I was working with had done some very good work. So, you know, one of the things we're trying to do is to get some of that work published. Now, of course, one of the difficulties with publication is it isn't all a smooth process, and there's an awful lot of rejection to deal with along the way. One particular student just approached me out of the blue. He had finished his undergraduate and was waiting to do his master's. And he actually said, can we try and write something together? Now, we tried to get his final year project published. That was rejected 3 times. Is now in submission for a 4th time. But along the way, we started on a couple of other pieces of work. And we've actually had 2 major peer-reviewed papers published.
Wow.
We've just written an editorial together. And I'm sure we're going to be collaborating on other work as well. So that was someone who approached me. It's an interesting thing, publication, because I think publication really, to my mind, depends on how ambitious the student is. Okay. So if a PhD student wants to get published and they really push that, then they will get published. But, you know, if you're just going to wait for it to come, it's not going to happen. And, you know, I've had PhD students who've published quite a bit. They've got to be driven. And when they're driven, that drives me. And together we can achieve things. So I think it has offered an opportunity for people to do more writing. I've published more in the last year than in my entire career.
Really? Wow. I think that's those words can go across all kinds of life events. You know, if you really want to do anything, you will achieve it, won't you? If you don't, nothing's going to just come and knock on your door. Whether it's publications or just getting a job or coping, I guess, with any situation. It's a really good word. So how, you said that lockdown 1 was particularly hard for you. What coping mechanisms did you use?
I think my main coping mechanism was eating.
I think we can all relate to that.
I think that was the main way. I gave up drinking about 4.5 years ago, so that wasn't an option. Though I think for a number of people, probably alcohol consumption was very high. Not for me. So yeah, mainly eating. Because I couldn't go out and walk because you weren't allowed out at first. People said, "Oh, you could have just sneaked out in the morning when there weren't many people around." But I stuck to the letter of the law religiously. I think this lockdown's been a bit easier. I've gone out to the supermarket at night when it's much quieter and got some groceries. At that stage, I was relying on a colleague and her husband to drop food off for me on a weekly basis, and you know, that without their support, it would have been so much harder. I mean, it was so difficult that towards the end, I'd forgotten my PIN number because if you're not using your PIN number, you see.
Yeah, cool.
When do you use your PIN number? When you actually buy something at the supermarket, you make a cash point withdrawal, and I completely forgot it. So that was a bit of a difficulty, but hasn't happened this time around.
That's good. How have you found doing lectures online during COVID? How has that been? And not just lectures, but supporting students.
I think, I mean, that's actually probably it's been more convenient for students to actually have Zoom sessions with their PhD supervisor, because you've not got to travel all the way to university for a 1 hour meeting, travel all the way back. You know, so that's been really convenient. I don't think that has suffered. I think lectures are a different thing. It's very hard to be as enthusiastic sitting in at a chair in your office as it is in front of a room of people. And there have been a number of complaints from academics about the numbers of students that don't have the camera on. So you might be speaking to a screen where there's actually only one person who's actually there with you, as it were, looking at you. So I think you miss those cues. You also, funny enough, the few sessions that I was in for on campus, when people have the masks on, you can't really get the proper facial cues with masks on. So I think that's what we will go back to initially, to classrooms with masks, and that's going to be a bit tricky. But I think it's much harder for PhD students, because for a PhD student anyway, you're on your own. PhD students are the elite of the university. They are the most talented students in that university. They're the people that are working towards the top academic qualification. There's nothing higher than a PhD. A PhD is the pinnacle. So, in that sense, I think we need to really value and respect our PhD students, because, they're doing the most difficult thing. They're doing it with the least support. I mean, you obviously have a training program, but, there aren't sort of regular lectures, modules, the way there are at undergraduate level. There's comparatively little teaching. So for a lot of the time, you're on your own and you have to work through it with your director of studies. So it's very tough. There's no question. It's a very tough journey, but ultimately very rewarding.
Yes. Whilst we're talking about journeys, I think it's important to talk about your journey.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did you find education coming out of high school? How was that?
How was education?
For you, high school, were you an academic student? Were you a student?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, I was probably one of the swats at school. And I had, my mother actually always sort of inculcated in me the notion that I was going to go to university. So there was no question I was going to go to university. I'm 10 GCSEs, O levels in those days, and 3 A levels, a grade B, which in those days were probably a little different than today, perhaps. I went to Reading University, got an upper second class honours. It was when I was at Reading studying psychology, and I hadn't done psychology A level before. In fact, I had no plans to do psychology. I was originally wanting to do geography, which was my best subject at school. We didn't have psychology in those days at the school I was at. And I went to a geography teacher and I said, listen, where should I go and study geography? And she said, why don't you just go and study something different? I said, what? Why don't you do psychology or sociology? I was a bit shocked at that, because I only wanted to know the best place for geography. Anyway, for whatever reason, I listened to her. And in the summer, I decided, well, before I went on summer holidays, I decided I was going to do psychology and sociology. And then over the summer holidays, as I read quite a bit, I thought, well, psychology seems a bit more interesting. Sociology seems a bit more flaky, if I can put it like that. So when I got to Reading, in fact, I discovered for your first two terms, semesters now in the language today, you actually did three subjects. So I thought, oh, wow, okay. So I didn't do the sociology. I picked psychology, economics and politics. Now, I'd studied economics at A level. I thought that would be easy. But in fact, it was the only one that when we had the exams, I couldn't go on and do to degree level. I could only do either psychology or politics. So I was a bit ambivalent about psychology because it wasn't quite what I thought it would be. I mean, in those days, you studied rats and there's all this complicated stuff about memory and learning. And I thought it was going to be all about understanding people. So I was totally naive. But funny enough, there was a chap in the karate club. So I was in the karate club at university. And he said, why don't you stick with it? It will get better. So I did. And I think in the second year, I began to think, well, I'd like to do clinical, which is, a branch of applied psychology, very hard to get into. And after I got my degree, I spent a year as nursing assistant, then a year as a research assistant before I got onto my clinical training. And I did my clinical training at the University of East London, which then was a master's degree. In the 1990s, it became a doctorate in clinical psychology, but in those days it was an MSc. So I did my clinical training, and then I worked in the health service as a clinical psychologist. And I suppose I developed an interest in research then, and began to think, oh, if we're doing this little survey, why don't we try and get it published? And it started off gradually. It was only really when I moved in 1992 to the Institute of Psychiatry in South London that my interest in research really took off, because that was the mecca of psychiatry.
What research opportunities did you have doing your undergraduate degree or moving on to so you said it was an MSc, was it, in clinical psychology?
I did an MSc in clinical. Well, really, you did a project which would really be akin to an undergraduate project.
Okay.
It wasn't very high powered because the main thing is obviously you were training to be a clinical psychologist. So you had to do, I think in those days, I had 5-6 month placements in different clinical settings. And you had exams, first and second year exams. And in those days, you had to write up 10 case studies. So 10 people who you actually were made better by your administrations rather than people who got worse. Well, at least that's what people tried to do. They tried to find the successes rather than the probably more common failures. But I suppose it's an even bigger area for imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Because how do you really know how you're helping particular individuals that you're actually counselling?
Yeah, exactly. What made you interested in clinical psychology? What was it?
Well, and it may be this was what the teacher actually recognised, because when I was 16, my mother died, and that was and still is the major trauma of my own life. Because that turns your world upside down. I was the eldest of 5 children, and I think obviously there was something in me about needing to be cared for, and one of the ways of dealing with a need to be cared for is to care for others. And there's no accident that I think 2 of my sisters became nurses. My brother was a nurse, and my other sister became a teacher. Now, if you contrast that with our closest cousins, they're all engineers. So we all ended up in the caring profession. They all ended up as engineers, So, I mean, I think given my sort of background, I don't think I was very lucky, actually. I couldn't have found a better subject than psychology.
looking back, are you pleased you moved from geography onto psychology? Do you have any regrets?
Not in the slightest.
No.
I mean, the thing with psychology as a subject is it covers such a broad range of areas that there's something in psychology for everyone. It's a subject that has got so much breadth that, I mean, if you're just interested in evolutionary psychology, for example, you could just do that. I mean, at our university, we've 3 pathways: psychology, psychotherapy and counselling, criminal forensic psychology, and straight psychology. We're hoping to have a new one on neuroscience, neuropsychology, starting in September. But, you've got such breadth in the subject. I can't understand what the fascination is with forensic, to be honest, as I'm much more interested in the clinical field. And I mean, the clinical field, as we know, I mean, mental health problems, when I started out, weren't as well recognized as they are now. I mean, it's the figures suggest that in a lifetime, perhaps 1 in 2 people will develop a mental health problem. So if we look at the 2 of us, it's one of us, Lyndsey.
Or both of us.
Or both of us, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay then. So carrying on with your journey then, so you said it was an M. Have you gone on to do a PhD? Has that been?
Yes.
Well,
when I went to the Institute of Psychiatry, I mentioned that's the mecca of psychiatry. So, suddenly you're working with people who are on the television.
Wow.
They're that famous. You're working with people who've done books and papers. And I was a bit awestruck. So the head of department who was still around, though he'd retired, was a chap called Hans-Jürgen Eysenck, who was probably the most famous British psychologist ever. I
recognize that name. Just
Eysenck Personality Questionnaire he's immortalized in that. Yeah. He's actually German, but he came to this country in his 20s and never went back to Germany. So he was floating around the department, and when I was an undergraduate, we heard about him. And you think, and here I am working in a department where he was the head. The head then, when I was there, was a chap called Professor Geoffrey Gray, who was very famous for the neuropsychology of anxiety. Now he had been a senior lecturer in Oxford. He was a brilliant man, and you worked with him and thought, wow. But that department was, I mean, most of them are now eminent professors. They were all clinical psychologists, but they were all focused on research in clinical psychology. So the post there was actually what's called a clinical academic post. So it's actually a clinical post where you're meant to do quite a bit of clinical research.
Okay.
And all of them did, they really were. I mean, talk about role models. I mean, virtually everyone there had published more than I had. So, there was only one way to go, which was up. But you never really, or ever would, catch some of these characters. They were so prolific in research terms.
What was your research area?
Originally, my research area was an area called psychiatric rehabilitation. And part of the reason I went to work at the Institute of Psychiatry was to work with a psychiatrist called Frank Holloway, who's one of 2 mentors I've had during my career, the other being Professor Kevin Gurney. I'm actually still in regular touch with both men. So they've been with me since 1992. So I've known them a long time, really. And they've guided me, they've inspired me. I've published quite a bit of work with them also.
Wow. How has your research changed?
So I started with psychiatric rehabilitation, and then worked with, Frank was doing research in case management, was a particular approach to working with people in the community. And we did work on that, on quality of life and a few things. And then Frank actually left, and he went to work in Croydon. And he asked me to go with him, but I was by then, I'm afraid, getting much more interested in the clinical work. So I really had moved from being a sort of a clinician researcher to being a full-time clinician. So for a number of years, my research activity went right off the boil. Now, paradoxically, it was in 2006 when the Institute was preparing for the 2008 research assessment exercise. Now, the Institute is a 5-star rated institution. So, it had elite people. And I got my PhD in 2005. And when I had been promoted to senior lecturer in 1997, they said, the only way you're going to go any higher here is if you get a PhD. You will never be more than a senior lecturer unless you get a PhD. Well, 2005, I got my PhD, but I'd taken my eye off the ball and hadn't been publishing much. So I was asked to switch over to a trust contract. There's a sort of symbiotic relationship between the Institute of Psychiatry and the Maudsley. So one was the research side, the other was the clinical side. And of course, the research was all with patients with mental health problems. So from 2006 to 2011, when I took early retirement from the NHS, I devoted myself for 5 years to looking at recovery from mental health problems. And that is still a huge interest of mine today. But when I moved to Bolton in 2012, I developed an interest in positive psychology. And so recovery from mental health problems and positive psychology are probably the two biggest areas of my research.
Okay. Just moving back a little bit, I feel
Yeah.
like we've skipped forward. So you said that you were a senior lecturer. I'm sorry, did I miss that? Where were you a senior lecturer?
I did, yeah. At the Institute of Psychiatry. And I was a senior lecturer in psychiatric rehabilitation, which was the clinical area. But as I say, I lost my way a bit, and mainly when Frank left. And, you can go back and say, I mean, you asked me, was it a mistake choosing psychology over geography? No, it wasn't. That was a very wise move. Should I have gone with Frank when he moved? Probably, but I didn't. And then, when I was asked to switch to a trust contract, which was actually moving from being a senior lecturer to being, if I wanted, an honorary senior lecturer. Now, look, when you've been a senior lecturer, being an honorary senior lecturer, nothing, because you've already been a full senior lecturer. So I refused the title and just switched to being a consultant clinical psychologist. But that got me into mental health recovery, and as well as my own ego recovery, I suppose, self-esteem recovery. And that was a really productive time when I co-edited 3 books and established a whole series of papers around recovery heroes, remarkable lives, and historical recovery heroes.
So talk to me about your PhD then. How did you end up on the PhD path? What was your thesis?
Well, I mean, one of the things there's a thing on YouTube where I've talked about doing a PhD and setbacks in academic life. And the first time I did a PhD, I spent about 3.5 years on it and wasn't getting anywhere. And I was doing it via the Open University. And I was given an ultimatum: you either take a year out or you finish. So I actually, in the end, decided, well, I'd drop out. So when I went to the Institute and they were saying, right, the only way you're going to go higher is if you get a PhD. So that was a great incentive to work on a PhD. And my PhD was about assessments and interventions in dealing with staff stress. So that's, what I did was I built on a lot of research I'd been doing for a number of years before that. So that had become another research area apart from psychiatric rehabilitation. And I co-edited 2 books. First book was 1995, Stress and Coping in Mental Health Nursing, edited with Lenny Fig and Sue Ritter. And then another book a couple of years later on occupational stress. And I published, I think, about 17 peer-reviewed papers and a number of professional papers. So it was going into an area that I was already very comfortable with, and I made that my PhD. But it wasn't a straightforward journey. And
no, sorry, I was saying no. It doesn't sound like a straightforward journey. Thinking about, you said you were given the ultimatum.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to students now completing their PhD? What would you have done differently? Was there anything, I'm trying to think, was there anything in the run up to that caused that chain reaction at the time? Because obviously you were working in the area, you were publishing papers, you were co-editing books. So what was it at that time where you just weren't able to complete your PhD?
Well, no, that was the sort of first time round. The second time round, I completed it because I'd actually picked an area that I was interested in. So I think what advice for a PhD student, make sure you pick an area that's going to sustain you, because you're going to be working on that for at least 3 years. Now, the only exception to that I've ever come across was my old colleague, Professor Gisliger Johnson, who finished his PhD in 18 months, but he's a one-off. Most people take at least 3 years. So you've really got to pick an area that you will like, because you're not going to be researching anything else for 3 years. So it's got to be something that really is going to sustain you as an individual.
Something that you're invested in, something that you believe. And for you, that's the difference.
Yeah, I think that's the difference for everyone. I mean, I think, that's why I have a student at the moment who's a brilliant master's student, and she doesn't know what area to do a PhD in. Now, she's easily capable of doing a PhD. She's one of the brightest students I've worked with, but she's not sure what area. And I think that's a real difficulty, because you've got to feel passionate about the area. I mean, I know you've chosen an area that you feel very passionate about. And I think that's the key, because then, that passion drives you along. So that you're better able to cope with the ups and downs of the PhD journey. I mean, no PhD journey is uneventful. There are setbacks, there are successes, setbacks, successes. It goes to and fro. So I think the most important thing is finding an area that you really believe in and you want to do something that's going to make a difference.
Of course. Is there, on the flip side of that, a possibility of becoming too involved? Could that be a negative, being too invested in your PhD area?
To be honest, I don't think so. I know some people might say that, and some people might say, well, you're only working in that area because it's an area of problem in your own life, for example. I think the critical thing is having the interest in the area. That's the main thing, because if you're really interested, that's what keeps you going. You want to make a difference to that field. And, in all PhDs, you have to have, and it's very difficult sometimes to prove this, but you have to make what's called a unique contribution to knowledge. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're really working in an area you believe in, you're more likely to do that than just, one of the problems we have at Bolton is, unlike the Russell Group universities, where there are a lot of funded PhDs, the problem with the funded PhD is you arrive on day one, here you are, Lyndsey, this is your PhD, which is going to be looking at eating disorders. I'm not really completely interested in that. Are you getting paid to do it, actually, Lyndsey? So just get on with it. Yeah. So, I think there are people, the problem with funded PhDs is sometimes you don't have a choice over the area that you're investigating. You have to follow what the funding is given for. So paradoxically, funding yourself, where you pick your area, is probably better in motivational terms.
Yeah, okay. How important is your supervisor?
Well, it is a very interesting question, because the problem with a PhD is you get allocated a director of studies, and you generally, in most cases, you're with that person for the whole 3 years. So that's the role of that supervisor, and how important that supervisor is absolutely critical, because you're going to spend 3 years with them minimum. So and you don't know who these people are. So I think that's quite tricky, particularly if you come from outside and it's one thing, isn't it, reading about someone and looking at some of their publications, maybe looking at some of their stuff on YouTube and think, oh, they're an interesting person. But it's only when you actually meet them and get to relate to them. And obviously, as at the PhD level, you're working in a much more detailed sense with the person. Previously, if someone's only giving you lectures, I mean, you're only seeing one side of them. All right, okay, you do a project with someone, you get to see them a bit more. But I mean, what's a project lasts 6 months? PhD, as we keep saying, is a minimum of 3 years. So it's a long time, and I think that can be tricky, because if you get the wrong person, oh crikey, what do I do? Well, contact Andy Graham and chat to Andy. Occasionally it happens that you swap students at PhD level, for a variety of reasons. I think we need to be much more open about that type of thing. It's not a disaster. It happens, and you get over it, get on with it. But what you can't do is keep changing. So I don't think it'd be good if you said, "Oh, can I have a change?" And then 3 months after you've changed, I think they may have made a mistake. Actually, have you got any more? Any more that I could have a go with?
Don't like that one.
Well, the problem in a small university is that there's a limited number of personnel. So who else could you have, really? But so this is absolute relationship with your director of studies is absolutely critical. I mean, obviously you've got a second supervisor. Their involvement varies depending on the student. Sometimes there may be co-supervision, so 2 heads rather than 1. That can be good. But again, they may have conflicting ideas on the best way forward, which leaves you confused. But I think one of the advantages of a place like Bolton for doing a PhD is because the focus in Bolton is teaching intensive research informed. People are not selected because they just have a research portfolio. And you're going to come across some of the best researchers may not be the best supervisors, because they're basically just interested in doing their own research. And again, when I worked at the institute, if you got one of the famous professors as a clinical trainee, you might never see them because they're often traveling all around Europe.
Yeah, of course.
So swings and roundabouts. I think.
What advice would you give yourself looking back?
About
so many different areas. I think you've had such a journey. I think in particular about your time at the Institute of Psychiatry. You mentioned one of your regrets may well be you didn't go with Frank.
Yeah, and another regret would be that I allowed myself to take my eye off the ball, and I didn't fight hard enough to stay there, actually, which was basically about getting more prestigious publications. I mean, that's a regret. I wrote a book chapter afterwards entitled "Best of Times, the Worst of Times," which is sort of nicked from a novelist called Charles Dickens. And
come on, no.
So I think it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, because when you actually you're asked to have a free transfer to the trust, it's pretty humiliating in some respects. But the time there, I mean, was fantastic, because to have worked with some of the greatest people. I mean, last week, or was the week before last now, Professor Julian Leff died. Now, Julian Leff, I was in a film that he was involved with, and he ran a supervision group, and I was one of the sort of members of staff in that supervision group. So I got to work with them quite closely. And, when you're working with people at that level, you never forget that. I mean, Isaac I spoke to a couple of times. Jeffrey Gray, as I said, was my line manager. The guy that came in to take over was Professor David Clark when Jeffrey Gray retired. Martin Seligman describes David Clark as the greatest clinical psychologist in Britain. Martin's wrong. I think the greatest clinical psychologist in Great Britain is Professor Peter Fonagy from University College London, who is a remarkable guy. But when you've worked with these people that are absolutely at the top of their game, and you're a colleague, they treat you as an equal. Wow. I mean, I was never an equal. I mean, I'm doing a session on Postgrad training program coming up on publications, getting published. And one of the slides that I've been preparing is being a big fish in a small pond versus being a small fish in a big pond. And at the Institute of Psychiatry, I was a little fish in a big pond. And part of your job there was not to get eaten by some of the bigger fish there. Whereas Bolton is a much smaller place, it's much easier to have an impact in Bolton. I think already I'm the third most prolific researcher in the history of Bolton. Now, I'm obviously not satisfied with that. I want to walk out of this university as the most prolific researcher ever. But, when you compare me with many of the characters that were my contemporaries at the Institute of Psychiatry, I'm not even in the same league.
Really?
So, you have to step back and think, how good am I really? And, I'm aware of my deficiencies. I'm aware of my strengths. But I know that, I'm coming up to 64. I would like to go at Bolton until I'm 70. And I'm determined. I'm really going to publish, and to bring a lot of students, undergraduate, MSc and PhD students with me, as well as colleagues, so that we're all going to benefit from that focus on getting the work we're doing actually published and out there and recognized. Every paper that we have published has the university's name on it, and it lifts the status of the university. So I think it is a wonderful place to actually work, because it's small, people are much more accessible. So you can go up to people and have conversations with them. Whereas, at Manchester, Professor Brian Cox gives one lecture a year, and he's escorted in by the security guards. He's escorted out by the security guards. You paid to hear him. Well, you'd be better off sitting at home watching him on the telly.
Wow.
Because you're not going to see much more of them than that. So that's the flip side of the top places, that you're not going to have the personal contact that you always get in a university like the University of Bolton.
So is that where you see your journey going next with regards to the publications? Because that's my next question is, we know what's happened in your past journey. Where do you see yourself going?
Well, when you're a professor, there's nowhere else to go.
No. We haven't actually got to that stage yet.
Just as the PhD is the pinnacle of academic qualifications in terms of academic posts. Now, unless you want to go into management, I have no interest in going into management. I want to leave a legacy in terms of publications with my students and with my colleagues. And I'm absolutely, at present, I think I'm on fire publication wise. And you've got to be robust because, every week there's at least one rejection of the paper. So you actually then, okay, look at the comments. How do we change this? Where else can we send it? And it's about never giving up. Actually, never believing that paper is not going to be published somewhere. And I suppose, it's the opposite of imposter syndrome. It's a sort of belief. Well, the great man Isaac said it to me once when I said to him, got on the lift with the guy at the Institute of Psychiatry one day, just Isaac and me in the lift. Now, he was probably about 81 then. And I said to him, I read in Gibson's biography of you, Professor Isaac, that when you were an undergraduate, you published 6 papers. And he said, yes, that's correct. So I sort of said, well, it must have been easy to get published in those days, mustn't it? So he paused for a second and said, well, nowadays there are so many journals. I suppose it balances out. And of course, he's entirely right. There are thousands of journals. So I always say to students, there's a journal there waiting for your paper. You just don't know what journal it is at the moment.
Yeah.
And, there's a pecking order of journals. So obviously you don't start by sending your first paper to the Lancet, which is an impact factor of over 70.
Why
and
not
rejects.
Start at the top.
Well, it rejects over 95% of the papers. That's why. So, to be in the 5% that's accepted is going to be really hard. So you start at the bottom and you work your way up.
Somebody once told me, if you think you can, you can.
Well, yeah. Well, Ken's entirely right, but I don't think Ken's got any papers in the Lancet, unfortunately. He's done a number of books, and this is another thing you have to watch for with books. And we've been caught out a couple of times with this. So one of my colleagues who has since moved back to Greece, the great Yanis Matsoukas, we had an application for an American PhD student who'd written a couple of books, and he wanted to do a PhD by publication. And Yanis said, great. And he came to Bolton and did a presentation. There was only 4 of us at the presentation. And I asked him the question. I said, by the way, who published the books? Who was the publisher? And he said, I did. I paid for them myself. And I thought, oh, no. And Yanis, I think I had to give him CPR, actually, collapsed at that point. Because, of course, anyone, if you've got money, anyone can get a book published. To have it produced by a proper publisher, it has to be peer-reviewed and go through all sorts of quality procedures. So what he actually had to do was to then write a couple of peer-reviewed papers, which he did, and they were published. And in the end, he got his PhD by publication. Wonderful chap, David Mahal. But, it wasn't looking good when we heard the books were actually self-published, or sometimes referred to as vanity publishing. So if you see a book that's like that, you have to raise your eyebrows a bit. And I think a number of Kens, he paid for them himself to be published, and that's great. It's great. A lot of people do it, but it's not the same as having to go through the peer review process and have experts scrutinize the work.
Okay. So you've mentioned publications just a few times. How many do you need then to be number 1 at Bolton?
How many do you need to
be number 1 at Bolton?
Number 1, okay. 215 at the moment. The top publishing person is Professor Dick Horrocks, who has he's retired, and he still continues to work part-time. And now, I mean, he's not publishing as many as he used to, so he's slowing down. So I'm rapidly catching him. I don't know how many years it's going to take me to catch him, but then you set the bar for other people that are coming behind. I mean, it's important because I think having an element of competition is good. I mean, we want and we are striving to make psychology the best department in the university because we're psychologists, because we believe in a subject. We want to make sure that the quality of our students The quality of our research is the best in the university. Last year, I think we were 25 in the Guardian League table, 20, 23, 25. The highest ever. Now, the thing about that league table is there's no research element in it. And yet universities are judged by research. I think the best we've done in the Sunday Times is 45 out of about 120 departments. So we're actually punching above our weight. And we have a number of sort of very ambitious colleagues who want to publish, they want to get research grants. They want to really lift the department, and we want it to be a place that the students are really excited to be there because they know that they're going to get published. They know they're going to achieve things in the department.
Yeah, it's a really good ethos to have. I mean, I can say I've certainly enjoyed my time within the psychology department at the University of Bolton. It is very much like a family. It certainly is. Now then, I do think we've probably skipped a bit again. We do seem to skip backwards and forwards. You mentioned that you're a professor and you're at the top you can be. How did you get to that journey?
Right, okay. Well, you get on that journey by landing a professorial post when one is advertised. Sometimes in life you have a bit of luck. We all need a bit of luck. It's probably the thing that most people are reluctant to admit because everyone likes to think they've got more control in life than in reality we have. A lot of the time in life, we can get lucky breaks. So I had retired from the NHS at the age of 54. I was sat at home and thinking, what am I going to do next? What do I want to do next? I was enjoying the life. I was going to the Royal Society of Medicine, which was my working man's club up in the central London, at over 400 quid for a year's membership.
Oh, wow.
And a wonderful sort of environment. And I'd come to the conclusion my NHS pension wasn't fantastic. So I thought, I'm going to have to get another job. And having spent my entire career working clinically as well as doing clinical research, I thought, well, why don't I go into teaching and try teaching? And I had to go at applying for a few jobs, and I got an interview at Bolton. And because I wasn't working, I spent a couple of weeks researching everything about Bolton. And so when I arrived for the interview, I knew a lot about the university, and it's quite obvious. And I've been for an informal visit before. If you really want a job, you've got to go and make an informal visit, meet the people, show how committed you are. But very fortunately, there were only 2 other applicants for the job. And out of the 3, they obviously chose to offer me the job. So I came to Bolton. And when, after I gave one of my first lectures, one of the students came up to me and was rather puzzled, said, why'd you come to Bolton? And I said, well, actually, if I was offered a professorial post, I'd have even gone to Scotland, because to get a professorial post is a sort of dream. And I mean, before I even came, I was having dreams about graduation day. And graduation day is, of course, an amazing day.
I wouldn't know.
Well, you will soon. But graduation day is an amazing day when, sort of all the academics parade. You get to meet the family of the students, partners of the students. And it's a sort of culmination of all the work you've done with that particular student. And yeah, I mean, it's incomparable, really. Because in one event, all of that work is encapsulated. So, you'll have your undergrads, you'll have your master's students. You may even be lucky enough, as I've been, to have some PhD students graduating as well. So that's one of the greatest things, I think, about university. And I think Bolton is particularly good at graduations. It's once said by an academic who used to be here, George does a great graduation. And he's entirely right. The Vice Chancellor does a great graduation. And the ceremony is always a fantastic ceremony. And I think, the Vice Chancellor very correctly has said that, our priority as a university is the student's experience. And one of the things about in the NHS was Great Ormond Street used to have the strap line, the child first and always, the child first and always. So their services are based around what's best for children. And, in the same way, universities, particularly in this day and age, have to really focus on the student's experience. Because, if that student experience isn't good, you'll go to the university next door. And, we're, I don't know, 140, 150 universities in this country, 120 do psychology. So you've got a choice, if you actually don't like it. Even here, you've got MMU, you've got University of Manchester, you've got Salford, you've got Chester, 3 universities in Liverpool, you've got Lancaster, you've got Cumbria. That's just in the northwest region. You've got, and I forgot UCLan. You've got all those different universities around. So, our university has to ensure that we are the best for student experience. Otherwise, students aren't going to come to us. So you have to put the student at the center of everything. Having said that, I think that students themselves have a responsibility. And one of the things that you're doing, along with other peers, is you're reinvigorating the postgraduate student body. And, I think the more effort you put into that, the more you will get out of it. Now, you're not going to have all the student body behind you because it's such a diverse body. There are lots of people, for example, who live in London, come up for supervision sessions, people who work remotely increasingly now. But I think, you will get out more than you put in from that engagement. And I think you're doing some phenomenal things.
How do you think the University of Bolton compares to your experience at the University of Reading? I know it's very different with times. I imagine that's changed dramatically.
Well, bizarrely, there were fewer people at the University of Reading when I was there than there are at the University of Bolton today.
Really?
However, nowadays, the University of Reading has an intake of over 300 psychology students. Wow. In my day, there were about 60 of us. So, the universities numbers of students were much smaller than they are today.
You're about 100 at Bolton. Is it about 100 in psychology?
Yeah, over 100. Yeah, 130, 140 now in first year. So, I mean, you actually, very interestingly, of course, the university with the lowest number of psychology students is Cambridge.
Really?
Which only has about 50 psychology students.
Is that handpicked?
But what a 50 they've got. They obviously are able to take the absolute cream of the cream.
They've never met me.
They never met you, and I think one of the interesting things that is very important and is much undervalued and underemphasized. One of our students recently came across a theory that talked about scrappers versus silver spooners. And this was from an American TEDx talk. And of course, one of the things we have at the University of Bolton is lots of our people have had to scrap for what they've got in life. They weren't born, as it were, with silver spoons in their mouths. So, we don't have many people who've been to public school at the University of Bolton. A lot of our people have come up through the state school system. A lot of our people have done access courses. We have a foundation course. So people who are not as strong academically, but they're very strong in terms of their life experiences. And one of the things that's particularly enjoyable about working, for example, with mature students is because mature students have so much life experience behind them that you're much more on a peer-to-peer level, I think, with mature students. someone's 19, 20, I mean, you're worlds apart. Well, I am, and I'm at nearly 64. I'm a world apart from them. My children are older than that. I have a granddaughter who's actually 19.
Oh, God.
So, and I think we get a lot of exceptional mature students. We get exceptional young students as well. But I think, and of course, the mature students actually know about how to relate to people professionally. They are all very professional, all very respectful. So, I think they're an absolute joy to work with, and you can really get them enthused in projects. And I think that's a great thing, we are the most socially inclusive university in England. Second, I think, in the whole of Britain. There's a Scottish university that's slightly better than us, but I think we are certainly the best in England in terms of social inclusion.
I think for me, one of the best things about the University of Bolton when it comes to it, I prefer older student rather than mature. I'm not entirely sure I've matured a bit yet, but is the level of belief that you give us. I think the advice you get, the support you get from lecturers, not just one lecturer, across the board, is the belief to believe in yourself, and that, we keep going back to if you believe you can, you can. It's that ethos. I certainly have felt that, and it's impacted on me to the point where I now believe I can complete a PhD, whereas when I first came to the University of Bolton, I wasn't even sure about doing an undergraduate degree. So I think that's, for me, what sets Bolton apart from different universities. It's the staff members and the belief that they give you, I think. In fact, I only chose the University of Bolton because of your talk back in April 2017.
Oh, wow.
Yourself and Dr. Bill Brown. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Tremendously flattering to hear that. Thank you.
I was actually supposed to go to UCLan afterwards, and I cancelled because I decided Bolton was it.
Well, UCLan's a very good university, and very good for psychology. And a lot of universities in the northwest of England are very good psychology departments. I didn't mention Edge Hill; that was another one I forgot. But very good psychology departments. But I think, I think what you get at Bolton, I think you're entirely right that the lecturers will have more time for you, and it's not just one lecturer, a whole bunch of colleagues who are very supportive and encouraging, and get a great thrill out of the success of the students. So your success is our success. When you get your degree, when you walk on and get your PhD, there'll be a lot of staff actually feeling really proud and really pleased for you because they've known you. They all know you. Whereas, if you're one of 300, how are you going to get known? It's impossible. So in a small university, you're going to get much more personal attention, and much more so as a PhD student. But obviously that attention is focused more on your director of studies and your second supervisor. Very important for all PhD students to realize the most important support you're going to get is peer support. So supporting each other because you're in the same boat. My PhD viva was second viva was 2005. Well, that's 15, 16 years ago. Oh, how anxious was I? Can't quite remember. And with each passing year, you remember it less. But that's going to be a big day. Not to frighten you.
Okay, then. So do you, just for the last part then, do you have any advice for PhD students or students in general?
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me was when I worked as an assistant psychologist, I knew all the papers that had been published in a particular area. I was probably at one of my most dynamic phases in my life, but I didn't know what to do with it, and I didn't capitalize on it. and guy I was working with certainly didn't encourage me to think about publishing anything. So I think my advice would be to make the best of the situation you're in, because you will not you're only a PhD student once, like you're only an undergraduate student once, and that process soon ends. So I think, like you're doing, getting involved in it, along with other colleagues, getting involved in the process, trying to shape the process, working with the academics, you'll get more out of it. So, it really is. It's like anything in life, isn't it? The more you put in, the more you get out.
Yeah.
But you're going to be the winner, because when you get that PhD, and really, I mean, I think, there's some academics say, well, you're only a proper academic if you've actually, done a teacher training, for example. In universities, I think the two things that are really important in universities, I mean, obviously you've got to be a very good teacher. It goes without saying, particularly now, student experience. But, you've got to have a PhD. And there are different ways of getting a PhD now: PhD by professional practice, PhD by publication, and not just the route that most of you are going down, which is PhD by research. So, academics, university, you've got to have a PhD. Second thing is you've got to have publications. I mean, if you can write a PhD, publications are actually quite easy by comparison, because a PhD is a phenomenal document, 80,000 words. A paper, 3,000 words, sometimes 2,000 words. So, I think that's the thing. You've actually, it will keep you in good stead the rest of your life. Having that PhD, that is the path forward. Supreme academic accolade. Work hard. There's no secret to success, really. It's all about hard work. I mean, Tony Blair used to intone the mantra, education, education, education. Well, I would say hard work, hard work, hard work. The harder you work, the sort of golfer Gary Player, I think, once said, someone said, "Oh, that was a lucky shot out of the bunker. How did you get that one in the hole?" And he said, a funny thing, that the more I practice, the luckier I seem to get. And in a sense, it's a bit, PhD is a bit like that. The harder you work, the more you achieve, And one of our students, actually, when he had his PhD viva, he'd already published about 4 or 5 papers. And the reports before the viva were, this student has already published in peer-reviewed publications. They must be good. Yeah, that's peer-reviewed. That's what the viva is about. You're being reviewed by a peer to see whether you're worthy of the title of a PhD, the supreme academic accolade. 2 people decide that. For most of you, an external examiner and an internal examiner. Those people determine your academic fate. It's a strange system we have, but that's the system we actually have. And the harder you've worked at it through those 3 years, the easier it's going to be, because you will have covered all the bases in your research, and with good supervision, you should get through that. Most people succeed. The failure rate of PhDs is very low. And whether you have imposter syndrome or not, good supervision will see you get through that, and you'll be confident that you will get through that.
Good. Thank you. I think we need to end on, don't count the days, make the days count.
Very true. I think, yeah, make the days count. Make the days of your PhD count, because you won't get those days back. And avail yourself of every opportunity, including the possibility to do the teacher training module, the PET module. Try and make sure you do that as well. So that gives you an extra arm to your CV.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.